Good evening, ladies and gentlemen who have joined us on this Dr. Fundi channel via multiple social media platforms, via Facebook, via YouTube, via Twitter, Instagram, and also the Dr. Fundi website. Welcome to the Dr. Fundi channel. I am Fundi Nyati, and I'm the host of the channel. Today, we have a special guest who have joined us all the way from San Francisco in the so-called Silicon Valley of United States. Our guest is Mr. Afika Nyati. He was born in Port Elizabeth about 25 years ago. So he's a South African who is now in the US. He describes himself as a designer disguised as an engineer with a passion for human-computer interaction and the ways it can be used to augment ability. He goes further to talk about creativity, that creativity is a careful blend of knowledge, imagination, and beauty finished with a touch of serendipity. He's inspired by a promise of establishing robust digital information infrastructure, that is the systems that we use to capture, represent, analyze, organize, and communicate digital information. So his focus is on contributing towards the aspects that lie at the interface between humans and computers. Afika, welcome to the Dr. Fundi channel.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting that, the whole intro, but thank you so much.
Well, you know, it's important that we introduce you. Afika is a graduate of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he graduated as an engineer in electrical engineering and computer sciences about 2 years ago. He is now a tech professional that is based in the Silicon Valley, also attached to Stanford University, where he's working on the lab at the Stanford University. Enough about that introduction. I'm together with Nwami Santlama, who will also take questions, if there are any questions, and then we'll pose those questions to Afika. We've got only less than an hour because there's a family meeting in South Africa. Our president, our father, is going to be talking to us at 8 o'clock. So we have to be done with this conversation before then. And by the way, Afika is 10 hours behind us. So it's actually 9 o'clock where he is, 9 o'clock in the morning of Monday. And here we are just after 7 o'clock on Monday. So I just thought, I must make that aware. So he might still have a challenge of rebooting because it's still the morning. Some people take time to actually get going, and I know him as that kind of person, unless things have changed, recently. All right, Afika, welcome once again. We are going to talk about three issues, just three issues. We're just taking a break from the day-to-day talk around issues of COVID-19. So we're just looking at some global developments in the world of technology. So one of the issues in the past 7 days has been the fact that our export, Mr. Elon Musk, born in Pretoria, has just been, found to be the world's richest person, all right, for 2021. And that information comes from Bloomberg Billionaire Index. So the world's richest person as at the 6th of January, 2021. So we're going to talk about that. What does this mean? We understand that just last year, he was barely in the top 20 billionaires in the world. And in basically 12 months, he's now at the top. I want us to talk about that. What does it mean? But when one looks at the top 10 billionaires, in the world, a number of them are entrepreneurs a number of them are people who are in the IT space, in one way and the other. I want you to tell us, what has driven, this thing? Because in the past, it was people who were in the oil industry, and in other industries. But we find ourselves with a situation where at least, quite a number of people in the top 10 of billionaires in the world are actually in the IT space. That's the first thing we'll talk about. The second one, which is very, very, important, amongst people here in South Africa, a lot of people have been up in arms with regards to, some changes in the terms and conditions, of WhatsApp, which many people use here in South Africa, and I think in the rest of the world. People are worried about their data being shared with other platforms like Twitter, and some people are already migrating to platforms like Telegram and platforms, like Signal. So I want us to talk about that. And the last thing I want us to talk about, last week, we saw the invasion of the Capitol Hill by people, who are followers of the president of the US. And subsequent to that, he was temporarily banned, by the platforms. And that ban has now been extended indefinitely. He has tried to use other platforms. Those have been banned as well. So those are the three things that I want us to talk about. And we will release you because it's still the beginning of your workday, that side. And we need to also talk to our president, or listen to our president this side. So thank you very much. Let's start. Which one do you want us to start with?
I mean, we can go in that order. I think I'm fine with doing that. I think, well, to kind of give a background, I think I was chatting with these topics with my dad yesterday. And so he, in the process of that, thought it would be really useful to bring it onto this platform. And so I haven't had too much time to look deeply into these. So a lot of it will be off the top of my head. But yeah, I do have a couple of thoughts on, I think, all three of those things. To maybe begin with the first, which is basically Elon Musk, who, yeah.
Let's start by saying, let's not assume that everybody knows who Elon Musk is.
Yes.
Can you briefly tell us who is this South African that we are so proud of called Elon Musk, and how has he made his money?
Of course. Yeah, no, of course. So Elon Musk is a South African American entrepreneur that has worked on a number of various technology-based businesses, beginning from, let's say, mid-90s up until today. And in the process, I'll go through each one of them to kind of give a timeline of from there to today. But over the course of this, of course, he's generated value, has sold various companies that have allowed him to work on slightly more ambitious goals. And so today he is the CEO of, I think, Tesla, which is an automobile company that's automobile / energy, renewable energy company that's looking to essentially transition automobiles and cars towards clean energy, specifically relying less on fossil fuels, but more using batteries, which can be powered using pretty much any form of energy generation. So while today, yes, we do use gas and oil typically is how we generate electricity. As we move towards more renewable, the cars would essentially be powered through that. SpaceX is a space company that builds rockets. So that is still a private company today, but that's another one of the businesses he is CEO of today. And then there's various other small businesses. But to kind of give a timeline of how we got to today, if we look at, let's say 95, I think that's round about when he finished his undergraduate degree, more or less. And so at the time, I think that is more or less when the dot-com boom began, which is basically when the internet started to generate a lot of fanfare as an area where new businesses could be formed. And so I've done a bit of background, and from various interviews, Elon Musk himself mentioned how he was kind of at a crossroad where on one part, he wanted to go to grad school to work on problems related to renewable energy. But on the other hand, he saw that there was this very huge wave that was being generated where companies were being made on the internet. And so he decided that it would be a loss to not try to do something. And so he didn't go to grad school, ended up moving towards building a company. And so there were two companies that he and various other business partners made. One was called Zip2. They made about, I think, to give a broad overview of what they did, they pretty much brought city guides to the internet. So if you were, let's say, a company that dealt around giving guides in various cities, they basically allowed you to kind of do various aspects of your business on the internet. And so through that, I think they were acquired. I think they sold for about $307 million. And from that, he got about 22 million. And so from that business, he and various other partners moved on to a company called PayPal. And so some of you might be aware of this company. They essentially deal with allowing people to make digital transactions on the web. And so at the time, this was pretty unheard of in the sense that there's a couple things you had to kind of deal with. Two things I would bring up is when you're dealing with money, there's always this idea of trust. And so at the time, there was probably a huge behavioral barrier you had to overcome to get people comfortable with the idea of moving money on this new weird Wild West called the internet. And of course, there were technological things they had to overcome. So PayPal at the time did their thing and sold, I think, in either 2000 or 2001 for 1.2 billion to eBay. And this is also more or less when the dot-com bubble, I would say, burst. And so I think they sold at a very good time because most companies at this point, valuations went down. And from that, he personally, I think, acquired about $165 million. And so I think what makes his journey going forward pretty unorthodox is with that amount of money, you can pretty much decide to relax, not do much, kind of chill on an island for the rest of your life. But I think maybe what makes people excited about kind of him compared to various other people that could have been in a situation is he decided to kind of deploy that money into various risky projects that he thought would be useful just broadly for technological progress. And so the two of those I did mention were Tesla and then SpaceX. And so to give you the why behind those two things, Tesla, as I mentioned, deal with moving towards clean energy, around generating clean energy and using it, but also making sure that's what drives our transportation systems. And then there's this notion of SpaceX, which is looking at reinvigorating the space industry. And so I think those two things, or to give a bit of background, those two, I would say, ventures were things that no one was really putting any energy into or money. And so part of what led him to go into those, in spite of everyone around him saying that you're just throwing away money by even considering that, was
Yes.
he thought it was something that needed to be done, and so he was fine with making that risk, in spite of it maybe not actually being rewarded in the future. Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at both of those things, there had been various companies in the past that had considered moving to clean energy. I think in the 90s, a lot of automobile companies had considered it, but given, let's say, all of them being incumbents, where they had these companies that pretty much were making pretty decent returns, there was no real incentive to move towards something that was unproven, without much competition. And so there's that's on one end, the automobile industry. On the other end, if you look at space exploration, since the 60s, which was, I would say, spurred by the Cold War, there hadn't really been much innovation in that. And so without the external competition, which was generated by the Cold War, innovation in that area had also kind of slowed down. And so maybe the thing with technology is it's not always guaranteed what we decide to work on. And so he essentially, whether he was successful or not, saw that he could possibly move the direction or interest into these spaces if he was able to show some value. And essentially what we've seen today, if we kind of move all the way now, is if you look at the auto industry, pretty much every company has decided, based on their early wins, that the future of transportation is clean. And so most companies are, I would say, 5 to 10 years behind on technology and on what Tesla is working on. And so there's a lot of, I would say, lead that they have, but the goal of shifting the direction is one thing I would say they've achieved. So even if Tesla don't do it, it's likely that moving forward, the industry will be going in that direction. And to maybe talk a little bit more about the SpaceX initiative, up until SpaceX, the way that rockets worked were that you would essentially build one rocket that would fly out with whatever payload and thing you wanted to put in space, and it was not recoverable. And so pretty much every time you wanted to, let's say, travel to space, you had to make a new rocket. I'm not exactly sure how much they cost at the time versus today, but it's the equivalent of saying, if I'm every day when I'm going to work, we're gonna have to make a new car. So, which is very costly. And so SpaceX's first goal has been to make rockets renewable, where we actually recover aspects of these rockets to drive down the price. And so they are essentially a transportation business to space. And the idea is that when you reduce those costs, it will basically unlock space as an area where new economic activity can be created and brought back to Earth. And so that's kind of aspect one. Some of the things, and so how they've currently, I would say, been able to bring money into the business is largely through, I would say, government subsidies, sending payloads, whether that's satellites or maybe research related things, or even astronauts to space. Other things that they've basically looked at more recently to, I would say, create alternative revenue streams is basically becoming an internet service provider. And so on that front, if you've been keeping up with them, they've been sending about 60 satellites on a, I think, bi-weekly basis for the last year to space. And the idea is to create this network of satellites that could create a low-cost global internet service providing
Afika?
service. Yeah.
All right. I'm not sure what happened there. We seem to have a break in the transmission.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh.
Well, apologies for that break in transmission. I'm not sure what actually happened here, but our Wi-Fi in the office just went down. Yet it's something that one expects when there is load shedding, but there's no load shedding today, so I'm really not sure. But anyway, apologies to everybody for that break in transmission. We were talking about Tesla figure and SpaceX. Can you just quickly talk about?
I'll wrap it up. So I mean, I think I was last talking about SpaceX. They currently pretty much are a vehicle for government and private industry to put various things to space, but they do have this grand goal of at some point allowing us to kind of move to other planets. And so there is this larger vision, I think, around many of his companies that I would say has allowed, has, I think, paid dividends in terms of attracting the right talent, but also the right types of investors. And so that's kind of, I would say, broadly the various ventures that have, I would say, contributed towards this, I would say, the amount of money he's accumulated. But most of it actually is from I would say, his work on Tesla. And so what's very interesting about that is, and you did kind of hint towards this, in the last year or so, I think the valuation has grown from about, let's say, 50 billion market share to about 700 billion, if I last looked this year. And so a lot of that is not necessarily, it's not a valuation of an indicator of current value, but a lot of it is future value. And so I think people look at that and they're kind of perplexed because if you look at all the other car industries combined or car companies valuations combined, this number dwarfs them. And so if I were to kind of intuit what types of decision-making various investors are making that has led to this, I would say it's partly, I think, the successes they've made around electric cars. But there's, I would say, additional aspects that actually veer outside of the automobile industry. And so two things that they have been working on the last couple of years is self-driving car technology. And so the idea that there is creating cars that don't rely on a driver. And so that's one thing they've been working on. And so that is something they hope to eventually release in their cars. But included in that is this notion of an autonomous taxi fleet. And so the idea there is using these autonomous cars, they can create a fleet of taxis similar to, let's say, what Uber does, that don't rely on having a man behind the car to drive it. And so you're finding that I think a lot of people are seeing that as new business that's driving this number to go up, that moves outside of pure just automobile industry towards new ones. And so that is something that is kind of pointed to as a justification for this. But I mean, it's a very high number. I would say he made a lot of risks. So congrats. And like I said, the goal is kind of to move further than where they are today. And so I would personally expect this to pretty much grow over time, especially when we now bring in SpaceX, which would be doing additional stuff that is not being factored into this number.
Because they say the shares of Tesla from the market bottom in March last year have gone up by about 1,030%, right, of Tesla. And his personal wealth from the same time has grown by 548%. The question that I have then, looking forward, how sustainable is this? Do you think this guy will continue to be number one, or his wealth is directly related to the performance of Tesla, which you've just said it's likely to continue to be, growing based on the future that it's unlocking?
So if we're talking medium-term sustainability, I mean, I do expect that number to go down. But long-term, I would say I do think that there will probably be a trend upwards.
Yeah.
This is my personal speculation. So I think why I think this is the case is they have pretty much, they're still, I would say, at the end of infancy of kind of this larger vision. And so there's a lot of, I would say, room for growth. And as I did kind of point towards, that his personal wealth at the moment that is purely based on the growth that Tesla have created. So he owns about 20% of Tesla. And so we're not even considering, I would say, SpaceX, which right now is a private company. Purposefully, they don't want to make it public until they've kind of hit larger milestones. But that in its own, as I mentioned, if they are able to make a reusable rocket that can be reused at a frequent basis, could pretty much unlock space as a new area where companies can do work. And so that, to kind of include that into the pie of his personal wealth, I think would make it go up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's personally, that's what I think, where I think, I do think it will largely go up. In terms of currently, I can't say much about Tesla's current valuation. Okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Now, just one question before we get to the other ones. What is this that makes the guys in the top 5 of the richest people? You've got Elon Musk, you've got Jeff Bezos, you've got Bill Gates, you've got Bernard Arnault, and then you've got Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. All right. So, what is this about tech industry that is making people to make so much and accumulate so much money within a short space of time?
Yeah. I would say it's probably due to the fact that technology allows companies basically to decouple their output from actual people working. And so because they're kind of improving on automation, it means you don't necessarily need to hire as many people. And so that essentially lowers the labor cost, allowing for more profits to be attained. And so I would say kind of that's one aspect that technology in maybe various of these companies has created that maybe you haven't seen in previous forms of companies. I think prior to this model, I think what allowed companies to grow to the size that they had is the idea of economies of scale. So as you grow in your geographic footprint, you are able to then reduce the costs in that way. And so I think that is because they're dealing with, for the most part, digital infrastructure. You're not as beholden to physical things, which most of these companies built around economies of scale, that was kind of the main way you could drive down costs. So I'd say that's largely, I think, what has led to tech companies being
the
leaders, if you're looking at this ranking.
Well.
Yeah.
But then, in the world we live today, where the gap between the rich and the poor is actually growing, by the day. In fact, so many people have been, during this pandemic, so many of these top guys have actually increased their personal wealth, So the question that I have then, and this is really, is it fair in the world, to have people amassing so much wealth when so many are actually, below the poverty line? And this is, I just wanted to hear your views before we get to the one about WhatsApp.
My views, I think, are not fully formed on this. What I will say, I think if we're looking at wealth, though, a lot of this wealth is net wealth, I would say, but a lot of it is not necessarily liquid. And so I think there is a bit of, when we talk about, when we bring up this discussion, I don't think that distinction is somewhat made in the sense that, yes, this person owns, or his net wealth includes this pie, which is partly generated through Tesla, but he can't actually use that to to purchase things. And if you were to maybe sell shares, that would probably be a bad indicator to the rest of the investors, and so that would probably drive down their valuation. And so there is that aspect of, on paper, yes, but in practicality, it's not really something that they can use. But I mean, to your point, there is a lot of wealth being accumulated at the 1%, and it's not really, I think, being distributed down. That's definitely something that needs to be, I think we need to figure out some economic structures that I think incentivizes that trickle down effect, because I think right now there's few incentives that encourage that economic activity to create that outcome. So like I said, still forming my personal thoughts around this, but that's kind of what I would have to say on the topic.
Lovely. Let's move on to the next one. The issue around Capitol Hill, the invasion. We saw it, via CNN and other channels, what happened last week. But what's of interest to the discussion today is that towards the end of that, or during that invasion, we saw President Trump, sending out tweets that were almost encouraging these guys, to do what they were doing. And we then saw Facebook, Twitter, temporarily banning him. And that temporary ban has now been extended to become, an indefinite ban. Certainly a ban that will come to the time when he's supposed to hand over power to President-elect Biden. So the question then that I'm asking you, what are your thoughts about the ban of this president, from Twitter and other social media platforms? What do you think about the thoughts around that? But related to that, if it can happen to the president of the United States to be banned like that, what does it mean in terms of freedom of speech and all of that in the social media platforms going forward?
So it's definitely, I would say, moved social media into a new era around moderation. I don't think something like this has happened in the past. And so if I'm looking at the discussion that's happening right now, there is a lot of ambivalence as to whether it was, I think broadly, I think it was a good move to make, but it will definitely impact how these types of discussions and decisions happen in the future. And so I think what's interesting is, if you look at over the course of this social media era, I think at the start, most of these companies did not want to have to manage moderation. And so they wanted to essentially present themselves as almost a utility, where they don't have to manage or police anything that happens on top of that. And so what you found over time is that they have essentially been pressured towards being placed in a position where most people have seen them more as a media company, where it now becomes partly their responsibility to manage, to moderate certain forms of discussions and conversations that happen. And I mean, leading towards today or the last couple of weeks where they had to make some pretty tough decisions. I think what makes it a little tricky is if we're looking at this notion of free speech, it makes it pretty tough, because I mean, if these companies do have this role where they have to now be mindful of what's discussed, they are somewhat, one could say that they now have to be concerned about whether they're affecting someone's ability to speak freely. Of course, there are, I think, various different nations do have their own definition of what is considered free speech. And so if I look at Twitter's decision to kind of ban President Trump indefinitely, they essentially pointed towards aspects of what the US Constitution considers free speech, and where he had basically violated those. And so legally, they were in the right to do that. But it does set, I would say, an interesting precedent that I'm not quite sure how it'll turn out in the future. If the president of the US can be censored in this way, what does it mean? How does that evolve in the future? Is this something that, through, I would say, political pressure, could be applied in some other ways? I don't know. But that's kind of, I think, some of the questions that have come up.
Yeah, I mean, on the Economist of the past week, on the headline there, it says, who controls the conversation? Social media and free speech, which is basically what we are talking about. When one looks at some of the contributions by people, in the electronic version of the Economist, there's somebody who says freedom of speech on social media should not be controlled by a handful of unelected executives. That's somebody else's view. But somebody else says there is a responsibility with free speech that many people fail to understand. One does not go into a theater and yell fire when there is no fire. There are consequences to our words, and all of us must be responsible or pay the price. I believe a private company has a right to put some rules in place. What do you think about those two views by these people?
Do you mind repeating the first one?
Okay. The first one was saying freedom of speech on social media should not be controlled by a handful of unelected executives. But I mean, owners of private entities obviously are not elected people. You can't put them at the same level as elected officials, where they have got a constitutional, obligation to do certain things. So, but at the same time, we know that a lot of damage can be done on those platforms, which may, influence elections, which may cause a lot of harm. So how far do you go in allowing private companies to do their own thing without interference? And, should you put them on the same level as government? So basically, that's how I read that executives, because they're not elected people, should not control, free speech.
Yeah, no, I think that my sense is that the owners of these private companies would not have wanted to make this decision themselves. But ultimately, because I don't think much of this is described in the current form of the Constitution, they kind of had to make these proactive decisions. And so, yeah, I don't think they want to make it, but they had to. There's been a lot of, I would think, pressure both from employees and the general public,
Yeah.
to make said decision. I think we should probably move towards a direction where that is not the case.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I mean, it takes a while to amend, I would say, our legal infrastructure to essentially incorporate these new areas that I mean, I'm sure when it was written, no one can consider that this would be a case would have to factor in. So
Yes.
I think it's a tension of things are moving very quickly, and the current legal infrastructure is not quite yet at the same pace. And so what do you do in that interim? And so, yeah, I mean, that's.
Yeah. So as a player, I mean, as a player in the tech space, what conversations are you guys having? Are you guys worried? Because you guys are working on your own platforms, that you are going to be releasing into the future. Are you worried about what has happened? As much as it's justifiable what happened, but as a precedent, are you guys concerned as the tech people in the tech discussions that you guys are having?
So there's been I think a lot of there's a lot of ambivalence on both ends. I think a lot of people do look at this and they're worried about what it does mean long term. I think it's very hard to predict where things could go, but there definitely is a sense of decisions had been made that will likely have a long-term effect in how these social media companies run. I think another point that has come up recently is the fact that a lot of the censorship is not just happening at the level of the social media companies. There's actually been, there's this one social media platform called Parler. And so I think a lot of the right-wing activists in the US had essentially used this as their preferred service to discuss. And so recently, they had essentially been kicked off, their app had been kicked off both the Google and the Apple store. But in addition to that, they had also been essentially banned from using what's called Amazon Web Service. And so Amazon Web Service is it's a service run by a company called Amazon, which Jeff Bezos essentially owns, where they provide infrastructure that tech entrepreneurs can use. And so forms of infrastructure include like data centers or storage where you can store data. And so in the past, these were things that if you wanted to make a technology company, you would have to purchase on your own. And so they've pretty much removed that aspect of making these forms of companies. And so what makes it very interesting is that had for the most part been considered more of a utility where it should not, you should not be choosing who gets to use this in the same way that I would compare it to ESCOM turning off the electricity on, let's say, some criminal organization back in South Africa, where that I don't think that form of activity happens, but it's the equivalent of doing that, where more I would say fundamental technology things are now being censored. And so there's that additional layer to this where it's like, where do you stop?
Yeah.
Do we turn off their power so they can't?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's another, I would say, unanswered question
Yeah.
or open question that's being circulated.
But in terms of the ban on President Trump, you think it was the right decision?
I don't want to comment on that topic.
All right, let's leave you.
Yeah.
Let's leave you with that. All right. The last thing that I wanted us to talk about, we've got 10 minutes before we have our family meeting here in South Africa. It's about WhatsApp. As you know, I mean, it's one of those social media platforms that are used for communication throughout the world. You know, by businesses and also by individuals. Firstly, who owns WhatsApp, and what are the sister or brother companies to WhatsApp? And the reason for the question, so that you can just continue. The reason for the question is that a lot of us who are using WhatsApp, we've just received updated terms and conditions, and in these updated terms and conditions, it seems like we have to sort of give them more space to share our data with other platforms like Twitter and others, and also, so the question is around privacy and the sharing of data. So I'm not necessarily asking about WhatsApp per se. I'm using them as an example. People right now in South Africa are trying to decide, do they continue to stay with WhatsApp? Others are moving to, other platforms like Signal or Telegram. So the question that I'm asking really is the issue of giving away, your rights in some way and allowing these companies to share your information, and what does it do to your privacy and all of that?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question, and then I'll kind of segue into the privacy sharing of data discussion. So I mean, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook.
Yeah.
And so Facebook own a number of different companies or apps or services. So WhatsApp is one of them, of course. There's the main Facebook, but they also own Instagram. And so I'm not really surprised that they have essentially moved towards this direction, where, I mean, they recently, as you mentioned, sent out this updated terms of service, which seems to relax their policies around privacy and sharing of data. And the reason I'm not surprised, I would say, is for the most part, if you look at Facebook's business model and the way that they generate revenue, it is largely based around ad revenue. So essentially being a place where ad agencies or companies can, with high accuracy, target specific groups of individuals. And to get to that specificity, you need to have a good understanding of the people on the websites or on these services. And so one thing that they have, I think they're moving towards, is essentially having a single identity for everyone across these platforms. And so there's a number of reasons that has justified that. One of them is it makes it easy now to say, here is Afika, he's on Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and now I can use all those areas to get a sense of creating this profile of who he is, to get a better accuracy of basically being able to give him the right forms of ads. So there's that aspect of it, is that it will largely improve make that service a lot more better. But there's the other aspect of, right now, there's a lot of, I would say, antitrust discussion happening around these big tech companies. And so Facebook is one of the companies that's currently being investigated. Google is another one of them. And then there's Apple and Amazon. And so recently, Facebook had been essentially of those four targeted as essentially the scapegoat for these discussions. And so ultimately what these discussions want to do is essentially break down these monolithic companies. And so for Facebook, if they're able to put all these services into something unified, it gives them a justification that it's not that easy to do that. And so I think part of it might also be that rationale. But yeah, it's in terms of privacy, it's definitely a loss. I personally do think that the data that is generated on these services should be owned by the end user. In terms of how to do that, I think there's there's still a lot of experimentation on the right way to do that. For the current incumbents, I wouldn't say there's much incentive to move towards that future. And so I don't think a company like Facebook are incentivized to move there. I think the current business model is making them a lot of revenue. But my sense and my hope is that we move to a point where I can opt into sharing maybe all or even parts of the data that I create on a service. But yeah, it's definitely.
If somebody asked you, do I leave Facebook? I'm sorry, do I leave WhatsApp for Telegram and Signal because of this? Would you say leave or stay? Because I'm saying this because they could buy Telegram and Signal tomorrow, and then where are you going to run to? So what options do we have to stay or to move?
So I haven't looked too deeply. I haven't looked too deeply in the options. The two you did mention, though, Signal and Telegram. I believe Signal is a non-profit company, and then I'm not too sure about Telegram, but they both, I would say, from a feature stack, are pretty similar to WhatsApp. And so in terms of maintaining the experience, I do think they'll be able to do that. The hard part, of course, is moving your network towards this. And so if you don't have if not everyone's like, if you need to get everyone to say, let's move there, then I think that will be pretty easy to do. But without everyone making the same decision to do that, I think in practice, it'll be very tough to move away from a WhatsApp. In terms of either of them getting bought by a company like Facebook, my understanding is at least Signal, because they're nonprofit, they've done what's called open sourced the software that runs this company, which means that it's pretty much openly available. So even if somehow if Facebook was able to purchase Signal, someone else could just take everything they wrote, or that code that they made, and spin up a whole new one because it's publicly available. Telegram, on the other hand, I think they are a for-profit, so that is likely something that could happen. Yeah, I mean, I think those are two of the options I do see. Yeah, there's not too many options, I would say, unfortunately.
All right, Fika. Thank you very much. You still have to go to work. Not go physically, but you need to log in and start doing some work. So we won't keep you for any much longer. Thank you very much for availing yourself for this past 60 minutes. Apologies for the break in the transmission. Some things are not always easy to predict, but I'm happy that we're able to finish our conversation. So thank you very much. And yeah, maybe we need your skills, to try and help us not to have some of the challenges that we have here. But anyway, at the right time, maybe you will find a way to help us here. But stay there, gain as much knowledge and experience, and one day we will benefit from you. So thank you very much. And I also want to say thank you to all the people that joined us, for this past 60 minutes. It's almost time to now switch on and listen to the president. So I will not hold you any longer. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Afika, and thank you to everybody. Till next time.
Thank you.
All right.